Welcome to Headline Wednesday from Dispatch U.S. Military History Magazine, developed by trackpads.com.
Each week, we take one pivotal moment from United States military history and follow it from the first warning signs to the final outcome.
Today, we go to the waters around Cuba in the Cold War for the story of the Cuban quarantine at sea. A longer version of this feature, with fact sheets and photos, is available in the print edition, either on LinkedIn or by email.
Just before dawn in late October 1962, gray United States destroyers and cruisers rode the long swell of the Atlantic and Caribbean, their running lights dim against a dark horizon. On radar scopes and plotting tables inside steel compartments, the ocean did not look empty at all. Thin lines and faint blips marked Soviet merchant ships driving steadily towards Cuba, each one treated as a potential carrier of missiles and warheads that could put American cities under the gun in minutes. On the signal bridges, sailors waited beside flag bags and flashing lights, hands close to halyards and switches, as they reviewed challenge procedures one more time. In sonar rooms and combat information centers, crews leaned over glowing screens and paper plots, watching for the telltale patterns that might mean a submarine was trailing the formation instead of a simple merchantman. The sea felt tense.
These warships formed a ring that did not exist on any printed chart, a quarantine line drawn by political decision and enforced by men who often slept in their boots between watches. They drilled boarding procedures until the steps came out by reflex, from first radio call to the moment a boarding party crossed a freighter's rail. Officers rehearsed the ladder of escalation from warning shot to firing for effect, knowing that each order carried consequences far beyond a single hull and crew. Above them, patrol aircraft swept back and forth across shipping lanes, photographing decks and superstructures, counting crates and long cylindrical shapes on open cargo spaces, feeding the nervous situation maps in Washington. On mess decks, the president's recent address played again on tape recorders and shipboard speakers, his words about offensive weapons in Cuba echoing beneath low steel beams and hanging pipes as sailors picked at hurried meals. It felt like a normal deployment wrapped around something entirely new.
To understand why those ships mattered so much, it helps to pull back from that narrow horizon to the wider map of the Cold War in 1962. The Soviet Union had begun moving medium-range and intermediate-range missiles into Cuba, a revolutionary state only about 90 miles from Florida. If those missiles became operational, they would slash American warning times and place much of the continental United States, along with key bases and cities, under direct and immediate threat. For President John F. Kennedy and his advisors, allowing those weapons to remain in place meant accepting a new strategic disadvantage at a moment when Berlin, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, cohesion, and domestic politics were already under heavy strain. The clock felt compressed. The course finally chosen was a naval quarantine rather than a formal blockade, a careful choice of both words and tools. By announcing that offensive weapons would not be allowed through and that ships could be stopped and inspected, the United States aimed to halt the buildup without immediately triggering a direct clash of bombers and ballistic missiles. The quarantine was designed to buy time, to signal resolve, and to leave room for negotiation while still placing real pressure on Moscow and Havana. Warships, not bombers, would carry that pressure out onto the ocean. It was a bet on steel hulls and signal lights, instead of sudden explosions. The quarantine line did not appear overnight. It grew out of about 18 months of bruising encounters between Washington, Moscow, and Havana. In 1961, the failed Bay of Pigs invasion left Fidel Castro convinced that the United States would try again, and that the next attempt might come as open force rather than a deniable raid. For Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet leader, backing Cuba offered both a chance to protect a revolutionary ally in the Western Hemisphere
and a way to answer American missiles already planted close to Soviet borders in Turkey and Italy. Placing medium-range and intermediate-range missiles in Cuba seemed to him a way to change the global balance and show that the Soviet Union could threaten American territory as directly as the West threatened his.
In mid-October 1962, high-flying United States reconnaissance aircraft photographed launch sites under construction in Cuban fields and groves. The images showed missiles, support equipment, and crews bringing the sites closer to operational status with each passing day. Inside the White House, an emergency committee of senior advisors gathered around a long conference table, weighing military and diplomatic responses day after day. Airstrikes and invasion plans sat ready on the shelf, detailed down to target lists and amphibious landing schedules. Many uniformed leaders saw these options as the most decisive choices, believing that every day of delay would only harden the sites and put American cities even more directly under the gun.
President Kennedy and several key civilian advisors worried that a surprise attack on Cuba could trigger Soviet moves against Berlin or unleash a chain of escalation neither side could control once it began. They searched for a step that would clearly oppose the missile deployment, while still leaving room for negotiation and face-saving. The idea of a blockade raised difficult legal questions, so they adopted the term quarantine and sought backing from hemispheric partners to frame it as a collective response to the placement of offensive weapons. While diplomats gathered votes and ambassadors carried urgent messages in distant capitals, planners at the Pentagon began drawing arcs on maps, assigning carriers, cruisers, and destroyers to stations along that invisible curve. The decision to send ships rather than bombers toward Cuba set the stage for a confrontation measured in closing bearings and signal flags instead of immediate fire and smoke, even though the weapons lurking in the background were nuclear all the same.
For the captains pacing their bridges, the rules of engagement were as important as any navigation chart spread across the table. They were authorized to hail and inspect vessels believed to be carrying prohibited equipment, but only by climbing through a careful ladder of escalating steps. First came challenge by radio and signal light, then firm orders to stop, then warning shots, and only as a last resort, disabling fire aimed at bringing a ship to a halt. Any boarding would be carried out by armed but carefully briefed teams, whose movements on a freighter's deck could be interpreted in Moscow and Havana as signs of restraint or as signs of reckless provocation. Meanwhile, Soviet diesel submarines already deployed into the area tried to shadow the cordon, their commanders knowing they might be ordered to defend Soviet shipping, but also knowing that surfacing at the wrong moment could expose them to overwhelming force from the destroyers above.
Below the surface, the encounters were far more nerve-wracking and far less visible to anyone on land. Destroyers used active sonar to fix submarine positions and then employed small practice charges and signaling devices to urge them to surface, a kind of underwater tap on the shoulder. For the crews inside those cramped Soviet boats, the muffled thuds and creaks of nearby explosions sounded close enough to be life-threatening, especially as temperatures climbed and air grew stale. At least one submarine commander, struggling with heat, low battery power, and limited communication with higher authority, weighed the use of a nuclear-armed torpedo carried aboard as a possible defensive measure. On the American side, officers on bridge wings and in operations rooms understood that a misjudged depth charge pattern or a submarine misreading the intent of those signals could turn a tense standoff into a real underwater battle within minutes.
That dangerous weekend at sea would show both how fragile and how strong the quarantine really was. The turning point did not arrive as a single dramatic clash, but as a series of small, easily missed movements on chart tables and plotting boards. As the quarantine tightened, some Soviet ships believed to be carrying the most sensitive cargo began to slow, then change course, then reverse direction before reaching the line. These decisions showed up as gentle bends in grease pencil tracks,
a steady bearing drifting just enough to reveal that orders had changed somewhere far away. For officers tracking those plots, those quiet turns were proof that pressure without gunfire could still move steel hulls and the decisions behind them. Each ship that turned back reduced the immediate danger that more missiles or warheads would slip into Cuban ports under the cover of the standoff.
In Moscow and Washington, exchanges of letters and public statements began to mirror these slow adjustments at sea. One message from the Soviet side suggested removing the missiles from Cuba in exchange for a public pledge from the United States not to invade the island. Another message, less public, added a demand that American missiles in Turkey be withdrawn as well. The Kennedy administration chose to answer the first message openly, treating it as the central offer, while addressing the Turkish missile issue quietly through back channels. While diplomats argued over drafts and presidential brothers carried messages in person, the quarantine line stayed in place, boarding teams stayed ready, and sonar operators kept their headphones on. The ships at sea bought time, showed that the United States would hold firm, and made clear that it would not race to the trigger. That blend of visible naval pressure and carefully calibrated political signals became the true turning point of the crisis. Within days of that exchange, the outlines of a settlement began to harden, and the ocean slowly started to relax. The Soviet Union agreed to remove its offensive missiles and bombers from Cuba under international observation. United States reconnaissance flights watched as launchers were dismantled, missiles were crated, and ships carrying them away pulled out of Cuban waters. In return, the United States publicly pledged not to invade Cuba, and, in a separate and quiet understanding, later removed certain aging missiles from Turkey. The quarantine line remained in force long enough to verify that the most dangerous weapons were truly leaving the island. Only then did warships peel away toward other assignments, and the steel ring that had once stood as a barrier between Soviet freighters and Cuban ports faded back into ordinary coordinates in naval logs.
The immediate outcome was simple to describe. There were no Soviet missiles left in Cuba, no American invasion of the island, and no general war. The deeper effects were harder to see on a map, but just as real. Both superpowers emerged from the crisis with a sharper appreciation of how quickly misread signals, rigid war plans, and limited communication could drive events toward catastrophe. A direct communications link between Washington and Moscow, often called a hotline, was established to reduce the risk of delay or misunderstanding in future confrontations. Leaders who had felt how close they had come to disaster began to look more seriously at arms control.
When visitors read about the Cuban Missile Crisis in museums or walk the decks of preserved destroyers and cruisers, they are looking at the steel that supported some of the most important choices of the Cold War. Those ships and their crews helped carry the world through its closest brush with nuclear war without crossing the final line. The story of the quarantine is a story of pressure applied by gray hulls and patient signals rather than by explosions, and of leaders who, under intense strain, chose to lean on ships and words rather than on bombers and invasion plans. Headline Wednesday is developed by trackpads.com as part of Dispatch, U.S. Military History magazine.